Hello, everybody. It is Sunday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Steelers mock draft tracker video by Ray Fittipaldo, our Steelers insider. Ray, you released your second 7-round mock draft of the season this week, so I'm excited to talk about some of those picks with you. There's also lots of picks from around the internet to recap. I think Shadur Sanders is the name that's gotten everyone's attention, but we're also seeing some trends toward some of these defensive tackles that Ray's been on top of since the very beginning. So, Ray, I'm excited to get into all that. How are you?
Good, Adam. Yeah, it seems like all the national people are either mocking quarterbacks or receivers to the Steelers. I think a lot of the local people are pretty firm on it's going to be defensive tackle or maybe receiver. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Usually the local guys are right, but we'll see what happens.
Well, let's talk through those defensive tackles first. We're going to make you wait for your Shadur Sanders talk. Ray, there was in your multi-round mock this week, you had the Steelers taking Alfred Collins from Texas in the second round. There was another mock draft this week. I believe it was Jordan Reed of ESPN who had the Steelers going Matthew Golden in the first round, Alfred Collins in the second round. So can you talk me through him a little bit? He's huge, 330 pounds, I think 6'5". Probably going to have a lot of people thinking about Casey Hampton, another former Longhorn. But obviously the traditional nose position kind of isn't what it used to be in the NFL. So tell me a little bit about why you like Alfred Collins and why we might be seeing more of him in these subsequent weeks.
Yeah, so he is not your prototypical nose tackle. He is not built like Casey Hampton, but he could fill that role, for the Steelers. Hampton probably 6 feet on his best day. This guy's 6'5", like you said, I think listed at 330 or so. And the nice thing about Collins is, you could put him in the middle and he could eat up a couple of blockers, but he's also very capable of bumping down the line, playing 3 technique or 5 technique as well. And, the one thing about, Collins that's going to be interesting to me in the pros is, I watched him on film and I was like, boy, he really moves well for a big guy. And then at the combine, he didn't test great. So, he doesn't have those like elite athletic traits, but when you go back and watch him, like what stands out is he just plays super hard. He's just always around the ball. And, sometimes with these defensive linemen, these guys who are uber talented, you don't always see that high motor. Collins always has a high motor. I view him as a safe pick, whether it's, second, third round, wherever that is. This guy plays hard. He's got the size. He's got a lot of things that can help your football team.
Yeah, I think the size is the thing that stands out, and I think that's what a lot of I think Steelers fans like to see, traits that stand out a little bit, and I think the Steelers have somewhat trained them that way. Another name that came up at defensive tackle this week was Darius Alexander from Toledo. Obviously, the Steelers haven't been afraid to go to that program in the recent past, dipping into it for Deontay Johnson. Alexander's a little bit smaller. I think he's just over 300, 6'4". He's very well regarded as a run stopper, but he also got a little bit more pressure on quarterbacks last season. I know one thing that we've talked a lot about with regard to how the Steelers defense works is the exterior pass rushers, like TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, maybe didn't get the pressure we're used to them seeing this season, in part because there wasn't a lot coming from up the middle. And so offensive lines were able to pay more attention to a TJ Watt or an Alex Highsmith. Can you talk me through why you might want a guy who can do a little bit of rushing the passer? He's not going to be like Aaron Donald getting like 10-plus sacks in a season, but at least, putting some pressure on enough that offensive lines have to think about him and then open things up for, the TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I mean, just watch the Eagles throughout the playoffs, even when guys like Jalen Carter and Milton Williams and other guys in the interior weren't getting sacks. They were pushing the pocket, and there was no place for the quarterback to step up, and that allowed the pressure from the edges to come in and cause problems. So it's huge. And Alexander is a guy who's really athletic, more disruptive as a pass rusher than production. So you kind of wonder, okay, well, you're in the MAC, you're a really good athlete. Why aren't you getting quarterbacks on the ground? That's maybe one concern. I saw a lot of like for a while there, like a lot of like first round buzz around Alexander. I don't think it's ever going to get to that, but I could see second or third round. And he's a guy who did test well at the combine. So, there's that upside athletically. You can kind of mold him into the player that you want him to be. And there's not going to be a lot of questions, right? Like sometimes when you're coming from a lower level of competitions, there's questions, can you do it against elite competition week in and week out? When you got those athletic traits and you posted the numbers he did at the combine, it's a lot easier to make those decisions, in NFL front offices.
Ray, we talk about, Brian and I were on this video last week talking about Kenneth Grant, Derrick, Harmon, Walter Nolen as maybe the holy trinity of first round options for the Steelers. But, we're continuing to see a lot of those receiver picks. Are there any guys that intrigue you beyond those two as possible day two options that could accomplish maybe not everything in Derrick, Harmon or Kenneth Grant but can accomplish enough that if you really like one of these receivers, you can feel comfortable grabbing them and then dipping into the defensive tackle class in the second round?
Yeah. I mean, listen, Collins certainly would be one of those guys. There are others. There are guys like in the third round, like Jamari Caldwell from Oregon would be your traditional nose run stopper, good athlete too, but that's the role that he would fill. Deion Walker, again, from Kentucky, huge body in the middle. Like my comp for him is Daniel McCullers. And sometimes people are like, oh no, you can't. Why are you comping a guy who might be a second round pick to Daniel McCullers? But he's just a huge body. He's like 6'7". And, unfortunately for Deion, he does, stand up a little bit. His pad level is not great. And just, it reminded me of McCullers. So again, he would be an option, I think, second or third round. We're talking about guys who play with great intensity. I didn't always see that, from Deion Walker when I watched him on tape. So yeah, I mean, when you get into the second, third round, maybe there's some questions you have about guys, but with this defensive tackle class, you got guys with size who could stop the run, and you got versatile guys who can play up and down the line who are, maybe more athletic than some of those bigger nose tackle types. So if you need a defensive lineman in this draft, you'll be able to get them no matter what you need. You need a run-stopping nose, you can get them. You need a 3 technique, you need a 5 technique. You can get all those guys in this draft.
And Ray, you had 2 defensive linemen in your first 2 rounds of your mock draft this time around. I know that's something you talked about with Jerry Dulac in Indianapolis. Was what is the likelihood that they could double dip and go defensive linemen in the first and second round? I think a lot of people would look and say Cam Hayward's there, Keanu Benton's there. If you got one in the first round, why do you need a third? I think my answer would be look at the Eagles. What's your answer to that question?
Yeah, well, listen, Larry Ogunjobi's going into the last year of his contract, may or may not be on the roster in 2025. So you're going to need a replacement for him. And obviously down the road, whether it's in 2026 or 2027, whenever Cam Hayward decides to hang it up, you need replacements for those guys. And it's not always feasible to draft a guy, the year that Cam Hayward retires, it's not always feasible to draft a guy in the first round, plug him in. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes these guys need, they need to learn under somebody. They need to figure it out at the NFL level. And if you have those guys in place, it's easier, to elevate them and they're ready to have success when it is their time. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be 1-2. It could be 1-3, it could be 1-4, something like that. But there have been teams who have done that. Look at the Los Angeles Rams. They took Jared Verse in the first round last year, and then they doubled down in the second round and they got Braden Fisk. And both those guys were really good players for the Rams. I know the Rams defense was up and down this year, but by the end of the season, I thought that Rams defense was playing really well. And I think those 2 young defensive linemen played a big part in that.
All right, I think we've made them eat their vegetables for long enough, Ray. Let's talk about Shadur Sanders. Dane Brugler of The Athletic mocked him to the Steelers this week. And if you're not super familiar with the mock draft world, Dane Brugler is one of those guys that when, he makes a pick, you pay attention. He maybe moves the way other mock drafters are thinking. So it's not as if this was like one random guy on a random blog saying maybe Shadur drops to the Steelers. This is a guy who's pretty plugged in and he thinks he could fall. And he's not alone. I looked at Lance Zierlein's mock, and he's like the lead scout for NFL.com. He had Shedeur dropping to 29. Trevor Sakema of Pro Football Focus had him dropping out of the first round entirely. So Ray, talk me through a scenario where Shedeur's on the board at number 21. You don't have to trade up for him. He's a guy that's been talked about as a top 5, potentially top 3 pick for much of this evaluation period. Does he make you rethink any of the Steelers' needs, regardless of whether they get Justin Fields, Russell Wilson, or anyone else at quarterback in free agency?
No, because I think you have to look at the overall grade. And, he was being talked about as possibly a top 5 pick in this year's draft, but only because quarterbacks get pushed up boards. What you have to pay attention to is, I think Daniel Jeremiah said it a couple of weeks ago. I think Shadur Sanders would have been the 6th or the 7th quarterback on his draft board if Shadur Sanders came out last year. So that's kind of the way you have to, frame it if you're a talent evaluator, if you're a GM in the NFL, and I'm sure the Steelers are doing it that way. Sanders is not a perfect, prospect. I think there's a lot of things that have to be worked out in his game. He's a confident kid. I think that has, he has that going for him. Obviously, a pretty good athlete playing the quarterback position. But for me, if I'm the Steelers, I don't go in that direction. I would be more apt to take a guy in the 3rd or 4th round, groom that guy behind the bridge quarterback, and then just, go from there.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way, Ray, of, you kind of did this. You went after the guy who was dropping on boards, and it wasn't just Kenny Pickett a few years ago. It was several of those other quarterbacks that we talked about as first-round options that ended up not getting selected until the 3rd. And you're right. When we go through these mock drafts, a lot of the quarterbacks get pushed up. But I think that draft was an example of how, oftentimes, regardless of what we're saying on the outside, the NFL GMs feel a different way. And if he's falling with these guys that we're talking about that do these mock drafts, there's a reason for it. And there's a reason, I think, for the Steelers to be suspicious and not just jump at the idea that, oh, man, this guy's falling. Maybe he's going to be our Aaron Rodgers type of situation.
Yeah, you got to be really careful with that. If you have conviction on a quarterback, yes, take him, but just don't take him because he's falling in the draft. There's got to be, some solid reasoning and some solid upside there if you are going to take a guy like that.
I agree. Ray, let's talk a little bit about receivers, some cornerbacks, maybe a little Will Howard talk, get back to the quarterback here on the back half of the show. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor. This show is sponsored by Mike's Beer Bar. Meet us at Mike's on the North Shore for the ultimate sports experience. With over 20 TVs, you won't miss any of the action. Pirates games, Riverhound and Premier League matches, college and pro football, hockey, and every major sporting event. Plus, don't miss the Post-Gazette's NFL Draft live stream happening Thursday, April 24th and Friday, April 25th, live from Mike's Beer Bar. Enjoy 300 local beers, 80 local taps, and incredible food like their famous steak on a stone. When you need your sports fix, and especially for the NFL Draft, tell your friends to meet me at Mike's. Ray, we still see, if I had to quantify it just back of the envelope, it's still 60-70% of the first round mock draft picks for the Steelers are receivers, such that when I go to prepare the show every week, I got to find something else. I got to comb through tons of these mock drafts to find some other guys to talk about. Why are we still seeing that trend so heavily? When the Steelers clearly have so many needs. I mean, I'm not even talking about receiver compared to defensive tackle. I'm talking compared to any of the other needs. And there's 3 names that keep coming up over and over again. Matthew Golden from Texas, Luther Burden III from Missouri, and Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. I'd be curious how you rank those 3 by their fits with the Steelers and their desirability.
Yeah, so I think I think they're all clumped up there, like right in that 20 to 30 range. So really it's going to be like, what flavor do you want? Who would, if you're the Steelers, who would complement George Pickens the best? And also if you're the Steelers, they're going to know going into this draft. We may not know, but they're going to know in their minds, okay, George Pickens is only going to be around for 1 more year. So it might not even be this guy complements George. It might be this guy replaces George. So I think for Steelers fans out there, you got to go in with an open mind, both when they enter free agency next week and when they draft a receiver at the end of April. So for me, if I had to rank those guys, I would probably say, Golden probably 1, Egbuka 2, Burden 3, but it's really close. And, Golden ran the grade 40 time at the combine. That was very promising to me. Also a smooth route runner. Egbuka is more of a, very high floor type of a prospect. Probably doesn't have like number one qualities, but I think he'd be a really solid pro. And, you could plug him in, I think, as a rookie. And I think he could be, if not a number 2, like a good part of your rotation as a rookie. And then, Burden is very smooth too. And, he's there. It's not that there's anything wrong with him. I just sort of view Golden and Egbuka a little bit ahead of him. But listen, if they got any of those 3 at 21, I think Steelers fans would be happy. And to your first point, the reason everyone's mocking them to them is because A, George Pickens might not be here beyond 2025, and B, there's a lack of quality depth behind George Pickens right now. So it's easy to see why it happens, but I tend to think more it's probably going to happen in the second or third round rather than the first round.
On your overall big board, Ray, do you put those 3 defensive tackles we mentioned earlier, Kenneth Grant, Derrick Harmon, Walter Nolen, maybe anyone else, do you put them all ahead of these 3 receivers?
I mean, that's a difficult question right now. Like you're saying, if all
6 of those players are available and you have those 3 defensive tackles and you have those 3 receivers on the board, how do they shake out for you?
Like Kenneth Grant's got a lot of upside, right? He's got the size. He can really, in the pros, he could be a 3-down defensive tackle who can, really be a disruptive force in your defense. I would probably take him ahead of any of the receivers. Nolen as well. I would probably take Nolen. I know there's some stuff that people might be worried about there with Nolen. He didn't work out at the combine. I don't really view that as a huge issue, but maybe some people in the NFL do. And Harmon, just because Harmon, the only thing that I'm a little bit down on Harmon is that he's this big guy, 315 pounds, and he's more finesse than he is power. And maybe it's just because I'm so used to watching Cam Hayward for all these years. But, Cam Hayward at that 5 technique, he's a power guy. He's bull rushing guards into the quarterback's laps. And I think, Harmon probably has that in him, but he would have to show that in the NFL. So, if you have Golden there and Harmon, maybe I'd be torn a little bit. But in almost any scenario, I'd probably take a defensive lineman there, and then I'd go get my receiver in the second or third round.
Ray, let's talk cornerbacks a little bit. A name that keeps showing up on the periphery of the conversation in these mock drafts is Will Johnson from Michigan. I think he started out this process as, maybe a top 5 pick for some people, given the playmaking ability he demonstrated for the Wolverines. That's kind of fallen off a little bit. I now see him a lot more in the 10 to 20 range, maybe closer to 10 to 15. Did not work out at the combine. And I think the reason he's been falling is those athletic concerns. He opted not to address them at the combine. Maybe he will at his pro day. But just as we sit here now, Ray, does he still intrigue you at all as a cornerback option for the Steelers? Or, going back to this conversation we just had, would you have to be a really special corner with no questions for to force you to reevaluate your thinking?
Well, I think if you're from Pittsburgh and you follow the Steelers drafts, they haven't always drafted corners well. So there would just be that trepidation in my mind that, could they, develop this guy if they got him? I do think the physical tools are there. I know he didn't, show that off at the combine. He's probably going to have to do it at his pro day if he wants to, go where he wants to go. So, for me, like corner is always a position the Steelers have addressed mostly in free agency. Maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe they do have to draft a guy high and, let them develop. There's also the other part that I wonder, the Eagles beat, and I hate to keep going back to the Eagles, but they are the Super Bowl champs. Andy Weidel came from there, but they built their defense from the inside out first. And then they added their corners, Quinyon Mitchell and DeJean last. And I just think that's the way you got to do it if you're the Steelers. Build up the trenches first, get a little bit more nastier, get harder to play against, and then you add those elite corners when you're really ready to contend. I just don't think the Steelers are at that point right now with their defense.
Yeah, I don't even know if they need to be elite. They just need to be good. And I think that's what we saw with DeGene and Mitchell's. They were, ready to step in. And life was made a little bit easier on that back end with what they were doing up front. Another name that came up this week in the first round, Ray, was Maxwell. Hairston, I believe Athlon mocked him to the Steelers. He ran a 4.28 at the combine, so pretty good there. A little undersized relative to what the Steelers tend to highlight in their drafts when they do go after cornerbacks. I'm not going to ask round, but just overall, is he a name that intrigues you at all?
Yeah, I mean, listen, 4.28 is super fast. I mean, that's elite speed right there. Productive at Kentucky too. So I think second round. I wouldn't go first round with him, but he's a good player, and I think he's probably going to be in that range in the middle of the second round if somebody doesn't snatch him up, earlier in the second round. So I think that's a name to keep an eye on. I think he's a really good player. When you test that well at the combine, as you know, Adam, sometimes you can push up draft boards as well.
Yeah, another guy who tested well at the combine was Jacob Parrish from Kansas State. He ran a 4.35. His athleticism score on his NFL.com profile was fourth among cornerbacks, but I believe in this multi-round mock from the Pro Football Network, he goes to the Steelers in the third round. Is that the range, Ray, where you start to think about value and if you really like those traits? My only concern about him is he's 5'10",
Right.
definitely undersized in that respect, but that's a lot of athleticism, and you're not taking as big of a risk going that direction in the third round.
Yeah, so ideally the Steelers like those big 6'1", 6'2" corners. They got Porter and Trice in the same draft a couple of years ago. Now, listen, they did bring in Dante Jackson, who's probably 5'11", on his best day, so they can make it work with smaller corners. But I do think, ideally, when Porter and Trice were drafted, what they talked about on draft night or that draft weekend was, having that big body on the outside with that arm length that can shut down those passing windows, to the outside from the numbers, or from the hash to the sidelines. So that's ideally the way the Steelers want to play. Honestly, when you're talking about rounds with cornerbacks, I got to see what the Steelers do in free agency first. If they go out and get a starting corner in free agency, you have Porter, you have Trice, you have the new guy, you got Beanie Bishop. I don't know that you need to take a guy on the first 2 days of the draft. Maybe you go fourth, fifth round. You got 3 seventh-round picks. Maybe you bring somebody in to challenge Beanie Bishop in the slot. So it's going to depend on what they do in free agency. Yeah, listen, if they don't get a starting corner in free agency, then maybe you do have to grab one on the first 2 days of the draft. But I don't think that's the route they're going to go. I would be surprised if they didn't bring in a starting caliber corner, or at least a guy who can challenge Corey Trice in free agency. I think that's the way they're going to go.
Yeah, I think that's probably the route I'd go as well, Ray. I think the argument we're kind of making here is you already have that young guy in Corey Trice, and it's just a matter of making him earn it a little bit. Considering we haven't seen a ton of him in his first couple of seasons. Ray, I'm going to wrap it up on Will Howard. You had him in your second 7-round mock draft on Post-Gazette.com. There was another, I believe it was that same Pro Football Network mock had him in the fourth round. I've seen him a lot in that, beginning of day 3 slot. But I've also seen him go, first round, second round. Where do you think his stock will settle out? And do you think that him being there in round 4 where you had him is the most realistic scenario for him?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't take him before the fourth round. I mean, maybe if the Steelers really like him, I could see that happening in the third round. But, been a lot of talk after the combine about how poor Will Howard's performance was. Let me just give you a little bit of perspective on, those types of atmospheres and how quarterbacks work. I was at the Senior Bowl last year. Bo Nix was down there. Bo Nix was throwing balls into the ground. Couldn't complete a pass, 5-10 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. And you're thinking, wow, like Bo Nix, he's got all this college experience. How can he be a first-round pick? But he goes to the right situation, and he's a really good player. He leads his team to the playoffs. And what you have to understand is, like at the Senior Bowl and the Combine, he's thrown to receivers he's never thrown to before. So that's a big factor in it. So I don't really put a lot of stock into Will Howard's combine performance. I think people saw what he could do at Ohio State. He did it previously at Kansas State. He's a good leader. Anytime you lead a team to a national championship and you make big time plays the way he did, I think that's promising for his future. Is he ever going to be a starter? I don't know, but the Steelers need quarterbacks in their quarterback room to be a backup. Maybe he's a developmental guy who can someday challenge for a starting job. But I think fourth round is, probably the sweet spot for him.
Yeah, I think who do they have as the third quarterback this year? Kyle Allen, and when he comes into games, you're saying, what is the upside here? He's just kind of an arm. I think with Will Howard, you get to the point where, if a Justin Fields, if a Russell Wilson, if an Aaron Rodgers, whoever the starter is goes down, when you have that backup going, you can kind of squint and say, well, maybe this is their future starter, or at least I'd like to find out whether he can be their future starter, and there's some upside there to talk about. Do you look at him at all like, even though there's not that franchise quarterback in front of him, kind of these organization guys like Mason Rudolph, Leandre Jones, a guy who could make a decent career here in Pittsburgh, even if he never is the guy for any long period of time?
Yeah, and the upside to drafting that guy as opposed to bringing in a backup is you got him on a cheap rookie contract for 4 years. And as opposed to, let's say, the Steelers want to bring in a backup, a top flight backup, then you're going to have to pay that guy 10 or 12 million, something like that. So that's the upside to getting that guy in the draft. It doesn't have to be Will Howard. You could even go like a different route, like a Jalen Milroe, who I know we talked about after my first mock draft, that guy with a ton of upside, but would be a huge project and probably wouldn't be ready to play for a couple of years. So there's a lot of different directions that you could go. There's a lot of talk about, Schuff, the kid from Louisville, and, he's got a lot of buzz here in the the postseason lead up to the draft. So they'll have some options on day 3, but if they got Will Howard in the 4th round, I wouldn't have any problem with that. I actually think he'd be a good backup in the league with some potential to maybe even become a starter someday.
Ray, any final thoughts? Any trends that are sticking out to you in these mock drafts beyond receiver? I'm hopeful that maybe your wisdom here on the Steelers draft situation is starting to sink in with some people, because I am seeing more of the defensive tackles than certainly we did through the first probably month and a half.
Yeah, so start paying attention to the top 30 visits. The Steelers are going to have 30 guys go to the south side within the next 6 weeks or so. They're actually starting. They actually started last week. They started them the week before free agency. So pay attention. Defensive tackles, receivers. That'll be a pretty good clue as to which way they're thinking. I think last year, Fautanu came in for a visit. I think out of all their draft picks last year, I think like 4 or 5 of those guys came in for visits. So that's really, something to watch. And like one more trend, in this mock draft for me, I didn't have the Steelers taking a running back until the 5th round. Well, these running backs, there's so many of them, and they all have similar grades. There's going to be teams that will take one, maybe 2nd round, maybe 3rd round, and there's going to be a run on running back. So it'll be interesting to see like which teams panic and take a running back when the run starts, which teams have patience, lay back and say, okay, I can get that running back in the 4th or 5th round as well. That's going to be another interesting thing to watch here as we ramp up to the draft.
Yes, looking forward to all of that. Ray, thanks for stopping by. Great to get you on the Mock Draft Tracker this week. Everyone else, I believe, Ray, you'll be back on Monday for the North Shore Drive with Christopher Carter. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel for that. I'll be back Thursday with Jason Mackey, talking whatever the big headlines are all around Pittsburgh sports. So lots coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, please pop a like on it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that. And we will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.